Welcome back from the break. Just for your information, we're going to start panel 4 in 2 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back from the break. The Qatar Mediation Forum is pleased to present panel 4, What Frontline Conflicts Reveal About Mediation Practice. This session brings together senior practitioners who have led or supported mediation efforts in active conflict environments. Moderating this panel is Dr. Randa Slim, who serves as a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins University, School of Advanced International Studies. Joining her on the panel are Ms. Hannah Teta, Mr. Carl Scow, Ambassador Dr. Akok Madut, and Mr. Joshua Walker. I invite the esteemed moderator and distinguished panelists to join us on stage at this time to begin the discussion.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to join the second edition of the Mediation Forum. And kudos to the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and its chairman for an excellent job in the first edition, but also in the second edition. My name is Randa Slim. In addition to being a non-resident senior fellow at SAIS Hopkins, I have just joined the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. to lead their Middle East program. It's my honor to be moderating this panel with such esteemed set of participants who have lots of experience to share with us on the field of mediation, especially mediation practice. Instead of asking each one of them to make opening remarks, I like to moderate discussions and conversations. And so we're going to lead this in the form of a conversation. I will be asking some questions to some of you. You can have the option to comment, to other questions that are being asked of fellow panelists. Let me make a quick preamble to this discussion, and then I will turn it over to our panelists since I don't want to take too much of their time. Frontline conflicts expose several critical realities that challenge and enrich mediation theory. Primarily among them is the gap between controlled environments and chaos. Mediation training, as many of you either teach it or have engaged in or both, often occurs in relatively stable settings with clear boundaries, but frontline conflicts reveal how violence, trauma, and ongoing threats fundamentally alter the mediation space. In addition to this gap between theory and practice, or between the gap between controlled environments and chaos, frontline conflicts make also more visible how stark power imbalances are and how they can affect the mediation space. You have often, in many of these conflicts, armed groups versus civilians, occupiers versus occupied, states versus non-state actors. And lastly, I think one element also, a critical reality that these conflicts expose and challenge our practice, is they show the limits and highlight the limits of rationality and interest-based approaches. Traditional mediation often assumes parties can identify and negotiate around their interests. However, as many of you in the mediation space know, historical grievances, identity, and existential threats drive behavior in ways that sometimes resist rational bargaining. So now turning over to our panelists. I think you already have been introduced. I'm not going to repeat what has been said about your impressive bios. The first question, and I'm going to address it to you, Ms. Tete. How does the presence of ongoing violence challenge the mediator's role and the mediation process itself?
Thank you very much. It essentially challenges the existence of the process. And therefore, your first responsibility is to protect the process and also to protect the participants, recognizing that very often there are also going to be power imbalances among the participants, and especially those who are in a stronger position and who have control over the use of force are essentially trying to use that also as an intimidating tactic. And so it puts you in the position of not just facilitating, as you said, an interest-based discussion, but making sure that you keep that process on track, such that the other parties also feel confident enough to continue to stay in the process. And I mean, it's easy to say, it's very difficult to do. It also requires, at some point in time, perhaps depending on the extent to which there is violence, to pause, to see if this can be located elsewhere, to manage the logistics especially in a very careful way. And at all times to put first and foremost the protection of the parties and the protection of the process, especially those parties that are in a much weaker position. And then you've also got to be thinking about how then do you buttress those in a weaker position so that they don't feel so completely intimidated or traumatized that they simply do not believe that there's any rationale for continuing with this process any longer. And in a mediation process, especially when you're trying to develop an inclusive process that is not just among conflict parties, but you're really trying to get interest-based mediation processes, which of course, and inclusive mediation processes, which are very much part of what the UN seeks to do. It is the civil society actors especially who are the most vulnerable. And so really trying to create that environment of protection, understanding the limitations, also understanding that maybe even within that civil society group, some may be in a weaker position than others. And so you have to make an effort at differentiation among the actors themselves in order to try to keep the key process of discussing these issues on track. And in the processes that I have been involved with, in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, when there was the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia. It's the people who are and Libya is not your classic conflict context because there isn't a war in Libya at the moment, even though there is the presence of violence on an ongoing basis. But when you're dealing with a war situation, it's much more intense than when you're dealing with the kind of context in which we have a at the moment in Libya, where parties essentially go about their day-to-day business, but when they begin to participate in processes that affect political and security interests, then of course people try to lean on them to make sure that they don't do it. It's different than when you actually find people who are so emotionally traumatized sometimes based on what is happening in an ongoing conflict that rationality escapes, and managing that process of trauma, creating a space where they feel safe enough to be able to participate and to engage on the process and not on their pain, then becomes part of the mediator's role as well.
Thank you. Mr. Scow, I mean, Ms. Tete talked about the power imbalances, and often in the literature, especially intrastate mediation, interstate mediation, the third party is called upon to help address this power imbalance, you know, through a number of means and tools. How do you address power imbalances as a mediator?
Well, frankly, I don't really know. I mean, I feel like what I bring to this is how we look upon this from a humanitarian organizational point of view. And I would like to make maybe three points to that. The first is that, you know, there is kind of a new term out there, humanitarian diplomacy, and you know, everyone keeps referring to that. So you know, what's that to me, leading the world's largest humanitarian organization? I mean, for us, it's always there to forward humanitarian objectives. It's how do we draw on the diplomatic toolbox, or how do we relate to those who have forceful diplomatic toolboxes to forward our humanitarian objectives? It's often to deal with access challenges, but there can be many more, and I can come back to that. But of course, it's often interpreted by people in this room as how can we use humanitarian to bring peace? How can that be an entry point, if you will, because that's often something that is less sensitive for partners or parties to discuss. But from our point of view, it is the reverse. It's how do we draw on the diplomatic toolbox to alleviate suffering, to save lives, to forward humanitarian objectives. That said, though, I realize, because here it's where, you know, there is the mutual benefit to us, that often in order to make a deal sustainable, you need quickly to deliver also tangible change to people. And I mean, I think a good example of that was when we had the ceasefire back in February in Gaza. You know, we were called on a Saturday to have 600 trucks heading into Gaza on the Sunday. And we managed to deliver on that. Had we not, I think there would have been many who would have wanted to kind of make that deal fail. And I think, again, with the ceasefire now we see in Gaza, we've been asked to deliver 150 WFP trucks per day. We have sustained that over these past month now. And so that's an example, I think, of where, you know, not only do we bring tangible change to people, but we're also part, in a way, of keeping a deal alive. My second point I wanted to make is, you know, why do we need to step up on the diplomatic side? I mean, I think the landscape from where I sit is a perfect storm, if you will. First, we are having needs like we've never seen before. Some 320 million people acutely food insecure, 2 famines confirmed. It hasn't happened in decades. And so the needs are historic. Second, we are seeing a funding drop that is dramatic. For WFP, we have had 40% cuts. We have had to lay off some 5,000 people this year. So, you know, that doesn't really match then what I said about the needs picture. But on top of that, you know, this, what is often referred to as kind of a breakdown of the rules-based order as we know it, is having direct impact on our operations. You know, in my engagements with leader, when I'm pushing for access or other things, there is a tangible change in attitude from only a year ago when, you know, I might not have been successful in my pushing, but there was at least tension in the conversation. Frankly, right now, it's more like whatever. You know, what are you talking about? And where, you know, because there is no one behind, and also, as I said, the money is much less. But it's also in other ways. So that overall kind of, you know, big power politics we now see has domino effects on what we do. You know, the rules are being reinterpreted in terms of how people are using, or groups using, or countries using terms like terrorists, sanctions, you know, right and left, rules on NGOs. That's one set. On access, of course, it's always been the case, but increasingly we're now seeing access being used as leverage by parties. I mean, Sudan, I think, is one example, Gaza, obviously, but there are many more. I think also we feel more targeted as kind of a soft target. It can be genetic. I mean, we've never seen more humanitarians killed than we have this year, but also as in other ways, non-genetic, like misinformation. I mean, UNRWA, I think, is a good example of that. And then, of course, on top of that, we have been, funded by some 10 donors, more or less. 80% of our money comes from 10 donors. And we're increasingly seeing a political agenda, a lot more conditionality in that. Extreme cases, of course, when now these private kind of humanitarian agencies have been coming up. We know about the GHF in Gaza. There is also some others floating around. And where donors then turn to them because they really serve political agenda. So I think none of this is completely new, but that it's all coming together at once and at the scale, I think, is new. And so that is, from my point of view, a little bit where the diplomacy fits in navigating this new, extremely complex political landscape in order to forward humanitarian objectives.
Quick question, just follow up on what you just said. How does political landscape affect your approach to neutrality and impartiality of the third party?
Well, it's a daily struggle, weighing dilemmas where there's obviously only bad options on the table, and we have to try to choose the least bad option. and so, there is never a perfect answer to that. What we are trying, though, is to, of course, two things. One is to be as consistent in how we apply our principled approach as possible. I mean, you cannot do one thing in one country and expect that not to be known about the next. So if you waver on a principle, or if you strike a deal in one place, you need to be ready to do it in another. But equally, if you're taking a hard stand on something in one place, you will need to stand that line somewhere else. Otherwise, you'll be called out for running double standards. So I think consistency is one. Secondly is transparency. It needs to be clear whether that's by donors or by groups we relate to or governments countries we work in, that doing business with us is above the table. And especially if you're trying to push us to do funny things, then, well, that's going to be known. We might in the end have to do it because, we want to save lives and we are determined to get there. But, it will be known that you had either put this obstacle to us or, this taxation or whatever condition it was, or even then if you're a donor that, you had restricted us in one way or the other. So those are maybe two approaches that we try to take to navigate that.
Thank you. Ambassador Madhu, I want to go back to the power imbalances. In your current role, how and your experience, how do you, I keep forgetting to put this micro next to me, I'm sorry. So in your current role and your experience, how are power imbalances addressed in a mediation setting?
Thank you so much. In fact, in every conflict, it's rare to find an equal balance of power. There's always an imbalances, and that should not stop you from mediating. If the powerful isn't listening to a mediator, you have to find other ways to apply some pressures in terms of influence and leverage that you might have, or maybe call in whoever have the leverage on that partner to be able to open up and be able to talk, because that power imbalance that party has came from somewhere, and that somewhere is where you need to talk to be able to help you address the power imbalance. But of course, there is a need for all of us to understand the dynamic and complexities of the current conflict that are going on around the world, especially for Africa, and therefore there's a need of mediator to be flexible, adaptable, and pragmatic to address all these issues that are coming up, whether it's power imbalances or any other aspect of the conflict that need to be addressed. Because this requires us also to have a mindset shift of a one-size-fits-all that we usually try to apply for all conflicts. Each and every conflict has its own dynamics, own context that need to be addressed, and you need to really face that conflict based on that context, whether it is local context, cultural context. You need to address them based on that instead of trying to apply a fixed approach. When you have a conflict like Sudan in 2023, for example, instead of trying to get bigger outcome of the mediation, try to focus on things that you can achieve. Things to do with humanitarian corridors, things to do with civilian protection. These are easy to achieve and be able to move and build on them until you reach an agreement where you are trying to reach. Also, with such complex conflict that we are seeing going on, there's a need for us to find time to mediate instead of accelerated agreement or quick fix agreement, which really risk a relapse. And for us, time is essence here in terms of trying to address the root causes of the conflict, trying to ensure that there is inclusivity, trying to ensure that there is a deep understanding of the local cultures, local history, to be able to really find a better solution to avoid a relapse. Otherwise, if we approach it the way we do things like in Sudan case, where we focus on ceasefire until now, we didn't get a ceasefire because the approach was completely wrong. It's one size fits all, and that need to change. Also, in a complex setting, there's a need also to have an integrated approach to a mediation. More of the time, we try to look at our mediators as if they are experts in thematic areas of the mediation. A mediator might not be expert in climate security, may not be expert in ceasefire negotiation, and therefore you need to have an integrated approach of having an expert to advise and guide the mediators. AU is rolling out the roster of mediation and thematic experts in January to be able to guide and support all our AU mediators to be able to address specific issues, because conflicts are getting complex and complex by the day. We are also trying to ensure the inclusivity of any process to ensure that there is sustainability of any agreement that will be reached. And at the AU, we have established what we call FemWise Africa, that is African Women Network in Mediation, and Wise Youth, which is African Youth Network in Mediation. They are not only there to sit in a mediation team of the AU, but also to ensure that the voice of the youth, the voice of the women, for example, religious group, are represented on the other side of the table between the two conflicting parties. So this is how we are approaching the complex mediation. We try to make sure it is all round and try to address the root causes and try to make sure it is sustainable to avoid a relapse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me do a follow-up question. In terms of, especially being, coming from the African Union, a regional organization, what are the challenges in the integration between a regional organization work in a conflict with an international, like the UN organization, work in conflict? You say that regional international nexus. What are the challenges there, and what are, the pros?
I don't see a real challenge. If there is, could be, coordination, but otherwise we share the same values. We have an agreement between the AU and the UN, and we work pretty very good in many conflict areas in Africa. We believe at the African Union that there's a need for partnership. The world is more interconnected, the world is more interdependent, and there's no way you can work in isolation. So not only with the UN, we work with our own regional bodies like ECOWAS and SADC, for example, and we also work with our partners. As I speak, we are working together with the United States on the DRC, with Qataris on DRC. So we are open to work with our partners as long as we would like to see our role recognized, and most of the time we would love to take the lead as a continental body so that we have the local context, we have the legitimacy, we have the experience on our own cases within Africa, so we'd like to take a lead. But we work very closely with all the UN agencies, we work closely with all our bilateral partners to help us address areas, because we think and we believe we don't have all what it takes to reach some agreement. We need our partners with their competitive advantage to make us succeed what we want to do, especially in terms of leverage, in terms of influence. Our partners sometimes can have that capacity that we don't have. So if we team together, it is a win-win, and it helps all of us, whether organizations, whether the country that we are supporting, it benefits all of us. So we are open to working with our partners.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, there is this whole issue of timing, and when an intervention needs to be made, and what is the best time, who decides. I mean, can you speak to this from your experience in terms of the issue of timing and how important it is, and what goes into determining the timing?
Sure. So first I'll state that I'm not actually a practicing mediator. I'm a political and conflict analyst, so I can speak about the multiple mediation processes that are ongoing in the Great Lakes region and with the Democratic Republic of the Congo specifically. I want to start, I guess, by saying that when you speak about timing, in this case at least, it's not just a question of when is it appropriate for mediation to begin, but also trying to reconcile the urgency that's felt on the part of public opinion in the countries where conflict is ongoing, and particularly in the DRC, versus the sort of longer time of mediation that can occur. And so I think that's one of the things that we've seen quite starkly in recent days. We had the ratification of a peace agreement in Washington, D.C. last week on Thursday between President Kagame of Rwanda and President Tshisekedi of the DRC with President Trump. But at the same time, fighting was really ramping up, in fact, in part of the area of the DRC that's controlled by the M23. And so there was this question of timing in the sense of there was a lot of pressure to get an agreement signed and then to also have a public ceremony with the president in Washington. But it created a gap, a very stark gap between the images that we saw, and it was actually kind of visible on the faces of the leaders, at least of one of the leaders, where we saw a somewhat unhappy looking President Tshisekedi sitting in Washington signing an agreement while conflict between the M23 and the DRC was going on. I wanted to add something though, because I think the Great Lakes and the DRC have seen multiple mediation processes, as I mentioned, over the last 3 years. And I want to make a point about something that I've heard recently talked about in the context of Sudan, which is the absence of shared facts about the parties to the conflict and how that adds to the complexity of the mediation processes and structures. And so, there's maybe one big disagreement that's sort of at the heart of all of this, which is that the DRC, along with UN reports and other investigators, claim that Rwanda is supporting the M23 politically, but also with soldiers on the ground, etc. And on the other hand, you have Rwanda absolutely refusing this. And so what began a few years ago with the DRC stating, we don't want to have a negotiation with the M23, we only want to have a negotiation with Rwanda, because that is in fact the master of this rebel group that we're fighting. Over time, as things persisted and as it dragged on, we ended up, in fact, with 2 mediation processes today, or at least 2, let's say. The Washington process, which resulted in these Washington Accords, which was between the DRC and Rwanda, and the ongoing mediation process here in Qatar between the DRC and the M23. And so I guess what I'm saying is that the way that this manifests beyond the structure of the processes themselves is that, for instance, when we are talking about the language that we see in the Washington Agreement, there's an insistence upon for the 2 parties to agree on 2 things. One is that the DRC will supposedly neutralize the FDLR, the former genocidaires from Rwanda who are in Eastern Congo. And the other is that, and I quote, Rwanda will, quote, lift its defensive measures. For most Congolese and for most people who are observing this conflict, the term lifting defensive measures is a sort of odd euphemism for something that is actually more like the opposite, right? It's stopping offensive measures. But because of the lack of agreement, at least in public, on who is actually doing what, it influences not only the number and character of the mediation processes, but also the content of those mediation processes. And frankly, it makes it very difficult, I think, at sometimes to speak about, because you're constantly having to refer back to things like lifting of defensive measures. Similarly, and I'll end on that note, there's the other, I would say, bone of contention is around the meaning of root causes. And I think we've seen this, it's the term root causes is deliberately politicized and instrumentalized by different parties. I think in an attempt to suggest that when they posit X, Y, and Z as being the specific root causes to the conflict, that means that the other party's claims about what they think are root causes are delegitimized in a way, right? And so all of this, I don't think this is unique to the DRC, but it's playing out in a specific way right now.
Thank you. Back to you, Ms. Tete. You referred to the youth and women, and also building on something that Mr. Walker said. The question is, as a representative of the Secretary General in Libya, and in general, based on your experience, how is a third party comes to the decision who sits at the table, which groups have to sit at the table? What are the definitions? There are groups that have in a way a political mandate, but there are groups that can be spoilers. That are groups whose voices are marginalized. So when you set up a mediation table, how do you decide? How do you choose the parties to come to the table? And then in what forms? For example, I have this pet peeve about these separate rooms that UN processes have. A separate room for women, a separate room for youth, whereas the large mediation table or the large negotiation table, especially in my part of the world, in the region, is mostly men. And we put women in these rooms and we put youth in these rooms, but not necessarily at the big table. So, back to you.
Well, we're guided by our normative frameworks.
Yes.
Because essentially that is what informs us how we should go about these processes in order to work towards a desired outcome. But I just wanted to build on the point that he made. That's becoming more difficult in the current context because we're seeing the reemergence of power politics, and where you have countries with very strong interests that also are engaging those who are the parties to the political challenge in which you find yourself, especially in a conflict context, and are engaging them separately.
Correct.
And then are having their own, if you like, bilateral tracks.
Yes.
With some group of actors. At the same time, your process is in process, and then you get expressions of support for the UN process, but at the same time, the actions that are unfolding are designed to, maybe not deliberately, but sometimes have that impact of undermining the process. And so then at that point, when you've developed this normative-based inclusive process, in order to be able to address, and the word root causes is challenged, but certainly the immediate causes of the conflict, and also to make sure that the agreement is sustainable, it then creates a situation where an actor can decide, well, actually, I don't need to do this. Because as long as I can engage at this level in this framework, which suits me better, right? Yeah. Then I don't necessarily need to engage with the UN process, and effectively it undermines it. But I think what we also should bear in mind is that these bilateral engagements on peace processes that are perhaps based on the presumptions that if they deal with what are the critical issues to the party, it's a quick win and it's done and it's finished. And then they can move on from there. And if there are transactional interests, which are increasingly more and more evident in a lot of the conflict contexts in which we find ourselves, those interests can be advanced. Well, as it turns out, that's not going to happen. Because ultimately what we have seen, because it's not a question of making some positions about the future, but what we've seen from conflicts of the past is that where you have not taken those into consideration and you've dealt with the issues on a very superficial surface level, it's a matter of months before the situation, even if you have what on the face of it looks like a sustainable agreement, and then you have the signing ceremony and all of that, and it looks like everything is all right. It doesn't take months before those issues begin to resurface again, because those parties to the process that feel that they have not been able to advocate their interest or advance their interest will try to do so by other means anyway. And that usually gets us back to where we were, sometimes with even worse consequences. So I think the current environment in which we are operating, where there is an effort to undermine the rules-based system and the normative frameworks within which we've been operating as dysfunctional. And if I may address the African Union in this matter, where as international organizations, even though at face value we say we are collaborative, but in reality we are competing, doesn't exactly help to advance any of those processes either. So if we're going to be very direct about these things in a way to try to get sustainable outcomes, then I think there is value in, of course, using opportunities like this to start a reflection on what actually is required to make a functional peace process, and not to have these kind of interventions that ultimately we see are triggering more and more conflict and create a world that is even at greater risk. So I know I digressed a bit from your question,
No.
but the issue,
Complimentary.
but the issue relating to how we get people into the rooms, I don't believe in a process that says that you have a separate track for women, a separate track for men. I want everybody to be in the room. But then we also have to bear in mind that all of these people we get in a room are representatives of other constituencies. And so if we just deal with the people in the room as individuals and don't design structures that help them to reach out to the constituencies they purport to represent, then of course what we do is that we are standing up individuals as perhaps being effective representatives, while we're not really sure whether they are that or not. Yeah. So we have to make sure that in designing these processes, we think about the structure of the mediation process in such a way that whatever we're putting into place can lead to complementary efforts, but ultimately that are supposed to strengthen the process.
Quick follow-up. Again, and it's not meant to be a criticism of your work or criticism of the UN, but there is this often, complaint that I hear from the outside about UN processes of the lack of sustainability from one rep to another, that you don't have a sustainable process, peace process, mediation process, but each rep brings their own take to the conflict, their own approach, and that impairs or, how to say, affects the chances of success, and some create more conflict.
Well,
Am I being unfair?
no, but I can understand why
Yes.
from an external actor it looks that way. But the fact is, when you've had changeover from one rep to the other, invariably it says that there's something about that, especially if the person, you know, more or less said, I'm tired of this and I'm going, right? I can't deal with it anymore. What it says is that there were things about that process that were not accepted by the actors.
Exactly.
And therefore, for anybody who comes into that role, the first thing you've got to do is to do a review of the past
Yeah.
and understand what your predecessors tried to do, where it worked, where it didn't work, why it didn't work. And so you're bound to take that reflection into your engagement.
Yeah.
Because if you were just to continue where it was left off and you don't do that, then, I mean, the problems that your predecessors met are exactly the same problems that are going to confront you, perhaps even on steroids. So there is always the need for a new reflection, and also the context can change.
Exactly.
And when the context changes, you also have to be responsive to that. So, as I said, I can understand where the criticism comes from, but I think sometimes, you know, it's an expression of frustration of the fact that we're still talking about this and it's not coming to an end. And so really, I think the focus should be on what actually are the issues that have or have not been dealt with, and what do we need to do differently?
Yeah.
Because if we do the same thing, we shouldn't expect a different outcome.
Exactly. Mr. Scow, I mean, again, I'm going to ask this question of you, which in my opinion is unfair, but I'm going to ask it. I mean, there is now, because of especially Gaza, what's happening in the Ukraine, how the West has approached both of these conflicts through double standards, especially the West. There is this loss of credibility internationally, and particularly in the global South, of the rule-based international order. I mean, people are feeling that we are in an interregnum phase, that the order that we knew has collapsed. We are moving to a new order. It's going to be a chaotic interregnum phase. We don't have a new order formed yet. But you, as a humanitarian, have, you know, to deal within a certain system of rules and regulation, normative framework that have been in place for a long time and undergird the international system. How does this loss of credibility in this rule-based international order affecting your work as a humanitarian? And maybe you don't accept with my take on.
I think that's partly what I kind of alluded to in my introduction, that I think
Yes.
we are seeing that on a daily basis, and it's making our lives very, very complicated in all kinds of ways. And of course, if permanent members of the Security Council openly challenges the basics of the UN Charter, that poses a challenge to that rules-based order. There's no doubt, and that is having domino effects all the way down, to the foot soldiers at the checkpoint. I think that was basically my point, that we are seeing very concrete examples and challenges of that, whether it is the use of access, humanitarian access as a leverage, if it is, the use of sanctions, making it even more complicated also on the humanitarian front. If it is using, the terms around terrorists thrown around, or new legislations of NGOs, or conditions on our contributions on who we can work with or who we cannot work with. So, I gave you kind of a menu of things that we are seeing, that I kind of attribute to this sense of everything goes, if you will, and that there isn't. There is a sense of impunity, and that there isn't accountability. And I think, again, that goes from the bottom field level, where we are often the ones engaged, to the Security Council and the macro level. But I think for us, if I look to some other trends, I mean, one is you know, the return of territory, if you will, as something that is up and being taken by power and that is being questioned. And so how that concretely,
What do you mean by that? Contested
well,
territory?
that there is, contestation around territory, and territory being, you know, an element of discussion and warfare. You know, with Ukraine being maybe the clearest example, but we're seeing that now in the DRC, in Sudan. I mean, in Yemen, maybe in a different way. But so, and you know, how that relates and complicates life for us is that there is a difference between sovereign control or formal control, if you will, and actual real control, which, you know, is for us who are an operational agency, is what we need to relate to. And so, you know, just to, if we now look at Gaza, for example, there is this new table called the CMCC meant to coordinate the entry of humanitarian goods under the peace agreement. Well, that's a good attempt, and we are part of that, of course, but it's not really where the actual decisions are being made. They are still being made in other rooms where we are also trying to be part in order to ensure that we have the access we need. In the Eastern
What
DRC,
other rooms? Which other rooms?
I mean, the formal authorities, the CLA, the COGAT, the ones that we have related to throughout this war and beyond. But I'm just using as an example. Yes. Here you have kind of the formal, and here is the real. The same in a different way, maybe in the Eastern DRC. You know, we've been struggling to reopen the Goma airport. Obviously, there is, you know, someone having a real control. There is another having the sovereign control. And so that is an example of how that is having operational implications for us as humanitarians. Maybe something that has been around for a while, I don't know, but it's certainly something. I mean, Yemen is an example of that as well over the past few years. The second is on fragmentation in the line of command, and I'm sure those of you who've been working in this field for a long time, that's again nothing new, but we're seeing that not only kind of, you know, the traditional classic that if you agree with the rebel leader at the top, it's hard to know if that, you know, trickles down to the foot soldier at the checkpoints when you take off on the road. But I mean, we're seeing that including inside government's authorities, that there is kind of a proliferation. You get an agreement on one side, but then that doesn't really doesn't hold with another side. We're also seeing that, you know, between local leader, community leaders, and so, you know, Sudan is probably the best example. When we set off, you know, from Port Sudan trying to get to northern Darfur, there is a whole set of actors. I mean, you can't fit them on a page in terms of what you then have to navigate through. And it's not only, it's both on the formal and on the informal side. And maybe a final reflection also on relevant to mediation is kind of the issue around timing. I mean, for us, there is often, you know, a humanitarian urgency. People are dying. We need to get there. And so that's what's driving our engagement, our operational engagement. But then obviously there is a political timetable that might look different, where it's about, you know, waiting until interests align sufficiently. And I think there is sometimes a bit of a tension between us and the peacemakers, if you will, because we just want to get there and get things done. And, you know, we have then to relate to a political dynamic that is different than where we are then being told to hold back because we might even stir up things that they are trying to pull together, you know, carefully in a sensitive political environment. And so that's also something I'm seeing in many places. Maybe a final observation would be around interest. I mean, in your field of work, it's always, of course, at the core of trying to understand what are the interests driving behind the different parties involved. And I think, you know, at least when I studied mediation and went through these role plays, it was a lot around the political interests, and it was kind of long term. What we're seeing in many contexts right now, that it's the interests are much narrower in terms of time. I mean, it's talking about a couple of weeks ahead, and it's very commercial. It's really transactional. It's like how much money can I gain from this? And so it's not really relating to a broader political agenda down the road, and much more transactional, much more short term, and much more commercial. That's what my colleagues are telling me on the front lines here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ambassador Madoud, do you have anything to add to the points that have already been made?
Actually, I don't have much, but I just want to address the concern of the external actors,
Yes.
which may not be genuine sometimes. But of course, sometimes I behave as a realist. Any conflict within the same household, if you fail to manage it internally, you expect your neighbors to come in. So when you have a conflict in a country, we should expect external partners to have a role. Could be positive, could be negative. And therefore, the only one that can really keep at bay these partners are the parties themselves to the conflict. But if they've invited them, it becomes difficult for the mediator to stop them. So what is left with you as a mediator is how to manage all these complexities of the partners that are having interests, whether it's positive or negative. You have to ensure that their interests are addressed as a part of the mediation. Otherwise, they become spoilers. So in every mediation processes, there are spoilers, and they need to be managed. That's why you have a mediation team. If it was something linear and smooth, you would not need a mediation team. So you need a mediation team to address all these complexities that are surrounding the mediation itself. But of course, there are many aspects, positive aspects that we find in dealing with all our partners. There are areas of comparative advantage that we think UN could do. For example, in the area of humanitarian supply or logistic, for example, if we have to undertake any mission in Congo, for example, we need MONUSCO. And this is how we try to work with our partners. When we were mediating the Ethiopian peace process, and we're trying to airlift the Tigray forces from the region, they could not trust anyone. They were able to trust one partner, and that's the United States. And they were airlifted from that area to South Africa, and we reached the agreement. So that's how I look at the partnership. Of course, it is true that some might not be genuine, but you have to find a way to manage them, because you can't make everybody to behave the way you expect them to behave. People are different, human beings are different, countries are different, they are driven by their own internal interests, and therefore you have to manage all these interests. Thank you.
Let me quickly add a question that's, I think common to any conflict, which is dealing with trauma. And people in conflicts, of course, experience lots of traumas. So how do mediators, deal with this? Whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Sudan, what kind of expertise you bring to the table? In a mediation team, are there people who are experts and helping you navigate this really explosive psychological terrain?
That is a very difficult question for me to answer, because that is sophisticated to address the trauma of the conflict. I have seen many conflicts brought to an end, and the trauma has never been addressed. My own country, South Sudan, got independent out of conflict, and we have the army that fought the war, leave alone the people, fought the war for 21 years, and we have never put them through some kind of psychological treatment. And you have seen some forces around the world, they go fight in Afghanistan for a few weeks, and when they come back, they need treatment. We never had that. So I don't really understand why not, but of course, it is something more of technicalities of the implementation of the agreement. But what I know is in terms of sustainability, where we deploy what we call truth and reconciliation to address the crimes, all kind of crime that happen, especially things that are psychological, to be addressed in a reconciliation type of what we have done in South Africa in 90s and in Rwanda and so forth. But in terms of the technical support, we haven't yet reached that level. It might be within the country, but as an AU, we haven't yet really applied that in images that I have the experience to share.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, would you like to address the role of trauma and how a mediator needs to approach that, whether it is official, unofficial?
I think I'll just say on that question that, one of the things that is very difficult to address in the current mediation processes ongoing in the DRC is the historical trauma, the accumulated historical trauma of numerous wars, where not all of the grievances of all the parties that have accumulated over the years can be addressed in the current mediation process because there's an unwillingness to recognize traumas committed by certain actors. And so I think that, that's ultimately problematic for the long-term success of any mediation process, because I think until, to be, sort of a bit simplistic, but until people on both sides of the border are able to acknowledge what they've done as well as what they've suffered, it will make it very difficult to find a long-term resolution to the conflict.
Related to that, the whole issue of transitional justice and how this should be part of the agenda of a mediator, and how difficult sometimes it is and how best to integrate it by a mediator in thinking through a sustained process.
I'm not sure I have a great answer to that question, not being a mediator, but my sense is that transitional justice is something, in the midst of fighting, right, like we see right now in the Eastern DRC, in the midst of what are considered maybe higher order problems, like whether the airport in Goma can be reopened, or who is going to control the territory that is currently being run by the M23. I suspect and I fear that maybe questions like transitional justice are sort of put to a later stage, but the problem is obviously that in these cases it is sometimes that never comes, or
Exactly.
it ends up in the peace agreement,
Exactly.
and it's one of the numerous things that are never implemented. And I think
Exactly.
we saw that a little bit with the Sun City Agreement in the DRC, over 20 years ago.
Exactly. Ambassador.
Thank you so much. At least from now, at the AU, we are trying to ensure that any agreement that is coming out of a violent conflict must have a component of transitional justice. And that's what I referred to earlier about truth and reconciliation and other justice system that we have. It is a key now, as it is a part we have the whole division within the AU that address those transitional justice. It is going on now in South Sudan. We are supporting South Sudan in that aspect. It is very important, and I think within that we can add that element of trauma in the process that can address those cases, especially when you see all the trauma of the war. We need to find a specific way of addressing certain of them in a more scientific approach than just generally in truth and reconciliation process.
Okay. I have one last question to ask to all of you, and then I want to turn it for questions from the audience. You have all taken courses in mediation, in addition to your practice of mediation. What are the blind spots in academia about mediation?
I think it's important to recognize that fundamentally we are dealing with a political problem and not an intellectual exercise, right? It's important to have a grounding and to have the tools to be able to try to have processes that can lead to constructive outcomes. But if you try to isolate this from the political context or the challenges that gave rise to the situation in the first place, it's artificial and it's not sustainable. Another thing is, even though we talk about, and it is important to focus on post-conflict, reconstruction, development, which also should address some of these psychological issues as well. Let's face it, all of these countries that have gone through conflict are also dealing with significant financial challenges. Agreements don't implement themselves. There has to be the resources to be able to implement the agreements effectively. Otherwise, everything that we've seen, all the challenges that we saw, that we provided for in a negotiated outcome, the question then is, who is actually going to make sure this happens? And again, when you're looking at the context in which you work at the moment, usually it's a UN country team. And then you have all of these capacities together, but we are also funded by external actors, our member states. And when we're not funded and the country doesn't have the resources, then invariably a lot of the pieces are not going to get implemented. So there's an ideal world of this is what you want to do in a mediation process, and there's the hard reality of the political context you're dealing with. And I think we probably have to pay a lot more attention to the political reality in order that we come to agreements that are implementable and sustainable.
Thank you. Mr. Scow.
Maybe my first reflection, just to pick up what Hannah said, is that, I feel maybe not so much, I don't have good examples on particularly negotiated settlements, but if we look at the Syria transition, given that, those of us who were here last year, it's quite strong to be here again a year in and the changes that has taken place in Syria. But my worry there is that it's not going fast enough and it's not impactful enough. I mean, if you were a poor widowed woman in Aleppo a year ago, you were struggling. If you're a poor widow woman today in Aleppo, you're struggling even more. And that is terrible for that woman, but it's also a risk to that political transition. And so, the international community has not been able to step up and really, create that sense of change and relief for people on the ground. It was the same in Sudan. The reason partly why we are sitting here with Sudan now is that, there was a window of opportunity. There were long, dragged out meetings about debt relief and sanctions relief and whatever. In the meantime, the people didn't feel that there was a change. And so, they probably wouldn't have voted for the coup that followed, but, there wasn't that people's resistance necessary to keep that political process going. So, I wanted to pick up that I think, we underestimate sometimes, if we underestimate it or if it's just that we're not able, I don't know, but to really create that sense of tangible change for people as part of pushing political processes forward. But to come back to your questions, frankly, I don't really know. But what I notice is that in the humanitarian field, having been more in the diplomatic before, there isn't enough thinking about how to do humanitarian work, but there's a lot of doing. You go out to the field and there's a lot of doing. On the mediation side, I have a sense sometimes that there is a little bit the reverse. There is a lot of thinking, but I don't see that many people when I come into the field. And so if there is anything, it's to turn that thinking around in practice. And, I'd like to see more of you when I'm out there in Khartoum or in Darfur. There is where the humanitarians are, but I think there would need to be more mediation practitioners doing that political work, also, frankly, to provide some cover for those of us who are delivering the humanitarian assistance.
Thank you. Ambassador Madhu.
Thank you so much. I think there are two blind spots. One has already been mentioned by SRSG, Hannah. But first one is insisting in what I call one size fits all. It is very important to understand the local context of the conflict, culturally, religiously, all aspects, to you to be able to prescribe a better way of addressing a conflict. But all the time, we are trying to be told that there is a one-size-fits-all that needs to be applied. And that is not working in so many contexts. Sudan. The first thing that we have been grappling with is ceasefire. We never reach a ceasefire. And I told the former US Special Envoy, the approach you are doing will not get you a ceasefire, at least in a short time, you will not get. Try to reverse what you are doing. Can you address the root causes, or at least the immediate causes of the conflict, which was SSR, that led to the war in Sudan? Can you address that? If you address that, you are more likely to get a ceasefire. Because you get that ceasefire on the table when they are talking, addressing why they went to war. But you are telling them, stop the war, people are dying. That's not how the culture works in Sudan. It's different. And I remember the 21 years of war of the old Sudan. They never had a ceasefire. If you force them in Addis or Nairobi they will sign it in front of you, but they are fighting because they talk as they fight. So please do that. By the time the both sides signed what we call Machakos Agreement, Machakos Protocol in 2002, which has the aspect of both sides of what they want, the war subsided by itself. And ceasefire was the last protocol to be signed. So countries are different. Second is what Ezra just said about implementation of the agreement. Especially when it comes to peace dividend. You need that. You need a support to ensure that this peace agreement has a dividend for the people. It cannot be just, a euphoria of agreement, war has stopped, no fighting without any dividend. Second, the implementation of the agreement is much more difficult than the mediation. So the role of the partners, the mediation, to ensure that the peace is being implemented is really, really very important. Never leave the parties alone to implement the agreement on their own, because not all of them actually are happy with some aspect of the agreement, because it is always give and take. And therefore, the only way is to ensure that this agreement is implemented by making sure there is an oversight that is supported by mediation, by the international community, to ensure the agreement is implemented and to avoid the relapse of the conflict.
And that's in fact my fear right now about the Gaza 20-point peace plan, is that there is so much legwork that's going to be needed once this agreement has been put in place. The follow-up, I don't think is going to get the kind of sustained attention, especially from the US administration, that it needs to go forward with. And that's, I think, a real concern that very much relates to your point, Ambassador Madood. Mr. Walker, you get the final point to make on this question.
Okay, so I'm not sure this is a blind spot, but I think it's important to reflect on the length of time that it takes to produce and disseminate academic knowledge versus other kinds of knowledge. And I say this because, having been in the academy and now working more in a policy space, I mean, we know that it can take months and months and years to get out a book or an article. And when you're working on a context where things are evolving very quickly, there is always the fear that by the time the thing that you wrote is actually published, it may already be dated or be soon dated. On the other hand, I think what the value of the slow mode of production of knowledge and dissemination is in giving you the remove to be able to reflect on longue durée processes and histories that are often blind spots in the kind of policy reports that are, try to be written in 3, 6, 8 months.
Thank you. Now I'm going to open it for the audience, to ask your questions. And please, when you ask your question, identify yourself and let me know who are you addressing the question to. Ma'am, in the back. Yes, you. Yes.
Zahra Langiem, Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy for Yemen and a former Libyan negotiator in the UN facilitated peace process. I thank Madam Hanna for putting the question of protection of civilians at the center of mediation efforts. I know many mediators neglect that at the center of what we do as mediators should be the protection of civilians. And I must stress that that should be done in a manner that does not undermine the agency of the groups that we want to protect. Linked to that is the question of accountability, which some of the panelists referred to. And it is linked to the question of how we design our processes in terms of the timing. And many times we put expediency over due process, also linked to the question of accountability and protection is ending impunity of warlords. If we really want to protect those who are marginalized, we need to end the impunity. But that is a dilemma, especially when we're witnessing the weakening of the multilateral system and having a toothless UN. So the question is, and since some of you have addressed the question of how to deal with trauma and whether that is linked to what we do, can we think of more innovative methods when we're designing our peace processes? For example, a track. I know that Ms. Hannah in Libya is now having the structured dialogue, and one of the 4 tracks is on transitional justice. And I know that in our region, and specifically Libya, we do prefer to use the term restorative justice. And in a way to humanize justice, can we focus more on storytelling, having reparations, commissions, and to integrate or complement rather than having retributive justice, to have restorative justice and to focus on that aspect, and how to link that to the efforts that we're doing at Track 1 Peace Process. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hannam, would you like to address this? Or anybody else? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Or maybe, I thought you would take a few more questions.
You want me to take a few more questions, not to do one at a time? Okay. Ma'am here, please. We have to remember the questions, right?
Thank you very much. This question is to
Can you introduce yourself first?
Marwa Awad with the World Food Programme. This question is for Mr. Madood. I served in South Sudan for 2 years, and we have a peace building program that we're working on, or the WFP is working on along with other agencies. And it actually did have quite an impact at a very small scale within the area of Jonglei. And I wanted to ask you, these points of success are very small. They're at a very local level, but they're extremely successful in helping people get the food security that they need and to also stop fighting with one another. So I wanted to ask you if you're aware of these peace building efforts and how can we maximize them or make them larger. One way, I think, is through storytelling, because when neighbors and different warring tribes know that peace is possible, then they can spread that more. But I'd be interested to hear your view. Thank you.
One more question from this side. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Hi, my name is Christine Chang. I'm from the War Studies Department at King's College London. And I was really struck by what Joshua Walker said when he mentioned the fact that there's an absence of shared facts. I think in the age of AI, there's all sorts of disinformation going out. And so my question goes to the SRSG and also to Mr. Akoud, thinking about how you're negotiating when it feels like the stories could change basically in the moment, right? Where all sorts of things are being fed out to you and the conflict parties themselves aren't quite sure what's real and what's not. So how does that affect what you're doing? How are you dealing with it? What can we all do to, make sure that that kind of disinformation, misinformation doesn't negatively affect how you're conducting your processes?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Erin McCandless, I direct the Qatar South Africa Center for Peace and Intercultural Understanding at the University of Johannesburg. And I'm wondering if any or all of you can give an example of a conflict where sustaining peace has been achieved, where sustained peace has been achieved, and what were the, what would you say are the reasons, and in particular around whether and how root causes were addressed and at which stage in the process? Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll start with you, and you can address all of the questions, some of the questions addressed to you.
Well, I certainly think restorative justice is important. We do capture it under the terminology transitional justice, but in the Libyan context, and since I came to Libya, one of the things that I've tried to understand, because it was pointed out to me early in the day, was how best to try to integrate the issue of transitional justice into a political process at the same time as you are having the comprehensive negotiations on other issues as well. So that you're talking about governance, you're talking about security, you're talking about the economy, it's the future. But given the trauma of the past, it was very clear to my colleagues and I that if we didn't find a way of making that also part of the process. Now, I don't want to create the impression that there hasn't been work done on this already. There has been. There has been work done by Libyans themselves. There has been work done with the support of the African Union. But the thing is how to bring all of this all together. And that really is something that has exercised our thinking in the course of designing this process. Because if we don't find a way to address that, and especially because in the Libyan context, there has been a series of conflict. You know, it's almost as if you're getting one layer over the next, and it will be never ending. And hopefully in this particular process, we're able to address it. But what is important, I think, is acknowledgement, apology, reparation, and looking at it from a victim-centered approach. And not just within the context of accountability, because even though it is important, what has happened, if I take other political contexts where we've moved from instability and conflict to stability, and if you remember, not 2-3 decades ago, it's happening again, but relatively recent time ago, West Africa was the capital of the continent and the world. And where we had peace processes that were successful and where we were able to strengthen our societies was where we had this combination of accountability and at the same time restorative justice. In some instances, in some contexts, for what were considered to be minor offenses, we put the past behind us and moved on. But in other contexts, there was the need to ensure that people saw that justice was done. And it's a very fine balance. So it's a difficult thing to do. Now, when people have their own sets of facts, how do you address that within a mediation context and in a political engagement context? That's why we really need to be able to maintain our political analysis capabilities and also be just as strong in our communication. Because then we're not leaving the statement of facts to someone else. We're doing it ourselves, but we're doing it also with the key actors there as well in ways that it's difficult for them to now come and try to create a new set of facts because it suits their particular purposes. But we are in a situation where, as the UN, as the international rules-based system is coming under attack, and we are less and less capacitated to do the work that we are set up to do, it makes it more difficult for us to try to generate these outcomes that could lead to perhaps some progress. And we sort of dial back what we see as an increased acceleration of conflict across the world. And I think it's unfortunate that it's happening at this time because it's the most vulnerable societies that are on the receiving end. And, you know, maybe this is wishful thinking, But I hope after about a year or two of this bilateral diplomacy, when we see whether these agreements have succeeded or not, and if they haven't had their desired outcomes, people will realize that there was a utility to the systems we designed, and there are no really quick fixes to these issues. And so we all should exercise a bit more patience in trying to get to meaningful, sustainable outcomes.
Mr. Ska? Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. First question regarding the world food role in the Jonglei state. I really don't have a deep understanding, but I have an idea that World Food Program is helping population in Jonglei state in terms of food support and also in terms of the fisheries, because in Jonglei state there's a lot of fish production. That was a role of the World Food in terms of empowering the local communities and providing them with some tools to be able to enhance their fish production. On the analysis, at the African Union, we have what we call regional desk officers who really follow up all our member states in terms of analysis, whether it's conflict analysis, and these are the knowledge that we use when we are trying to assess the situation in countries. We also have an early warning system that also look at, we call it continental early warning system, that look at all the hotspots across the continent, and based on that, we can predict what is happening or what is going to happen in those countries. So we have that analysis, and if you see when it comes to area of election in Africa become a source of conflict, and when we know that in certain elections in certain countries there is a possibility of post-election violence, we try to deploy mediators based on that conflict analysis. So for us to act on any source of information, we must ensure that it is a concrete and credible information before we make any decision on how to use it.
Ambassador Madi, can I just...
Yes.
I think, Mr. Ska, you need to leave us. You have another engagement, so please, feel free. Sorry, Ambassador.
No problem.
Yeah,
No
please,
problem.
go ahead.
On what stage do we address the root causes? I think root causes are addressed throughout the stages because it depends on what you are looking for. Let me give you the example of Sudan, South Sudan in 2000, where in the Machakos Protocol it addressed the Islamic system in the north, which is the main challenge for South Sudan, and it addressed the right of self-determination by the people of South Sudan if they don't agree with an Islamic state in Sudan. That addressed the root causes of the religious tension between the Muslim and the Christian in Sudan. They have also addressed the economic marginalization, where they agreed to split the oil revenues 50-50. They have also addressed the power imbalance in terms of the military power, where we created two armies. With a third army, we call it integrated units, to build on as a national army if South Sudan decided to vote for a unity. So all these cases are addressed at any stage, but you can't really avoid them. You may start addressing the immediate causes of the conflict, like in the case of Sudan, but you have to go deeper to address the root causes, why Sudan is at war with itself since independence. It is not just because the RSF differed with the South and they start fighting in Khartoum. No, that is a trigger, but there have been underlying causes that the RSF was a Janjaweed used in Darfur, the RSF was a Janjaweed used in South Sudan during the war, but there are root causes why this has been happening. It cannot be just without any reason. So you have to address them also. By addressing them, you will try to have a sustainable peace. And without them, there will be a vicious cycle of violence in any country that avoid addressing root causes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Just a quick comment on the remark about the distinction between expediency and accountability. Because I've been thinking about this myself. It's not exactly the same way, but somewhat similar, I think, which is the distinction between momentum and progress when it comes to peace talks and implementing peace. And particularly when, as I was mentioning earlier, when we've seen, this big signing ceremony in Washington last week, to sort of, and which I think was timed, at least in part, to sort of underscore that there was momentum. There's momentum in the process. Things are moving forward. Things are getting signed. Contrasted with, what I think a lot of Congolese would say is a relative lack of actual progress in actual peace on the ground. It becomes dangerous, I think, for the credibility of the outcomes of the process, because the bigger the gap grows between the momentum and the need to sort of keep maintaining momentum, especially in a world with so many conflicts and an American administration that is being pulled in many different directions at the same time, there's this feeling, I think, there's an imperative to maintain momentum. But when we do that at the cost of, having a situation where the peace isn't coming, but the momentum is still there, I think that becomes problematic.